that basically, like you say, builds a nest egg, and personally I believe gives better returns. The problem is, as soon as I start talking about that to freelancers and consultants, they go, oh, it's very risky, very scary, very complicated. You know, there's like the Gleasons of the world who have
absolutely
put this forward.
But underperforming is also risky.
Hi, and welcome to the WP Elevation podcast. I'm Mike Killen, a WP Elevation coach and WordPress marketing funnel specialist based in Devon in England. I'm very excited to announce that our feature guest is one of my favorite authors this week. It's Andrew Craig from Plain English Finance and the author of How to Own the World. In this episode, Andrew is going to walk us through the essential ingredients for taking control of our own finances and money while allowing us to save, invest, and even build a pension as WordPress consultants. Stay with us.
This is the WP Elevation Podcast, helping WordPress consultants elevate.
Just before we get into this episode of the WP Elevation Podcast, we'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, GoDaddy Pro, who help us make this all possible. But instead of just giving you a spiel about how great GoDaddy Pro is, we thought it would be more interesting to introduce you to a GoDaddy Pro customer, a WordPress consultant just like you, and see what kind of work they're doing with their clients and the impact they're having on their community.
Cindy Schaffstall of Spider Trainers has focused her business on promoting her local community. GoDaddy Pro Tools helps her achieve success by giving her the ability to gain access that she needs to make that happen.
Yes, I'm Cindy. I'm from a company called Spider Trainers, and our mission for the last 2 years has been to promote the area that I moved into. It's a very small town in northeastern Arizona. We live in towering pines. It's absolutely lovely, but it's also very small and sort of, I don't want to say slow, but they're maybe slow to catch up. So they haven't been introduced to new technology. So when I came up here, very few people even had websites. And the town was one of the organizations that didn't have a website. And I realized that as an entrepreneur, I could have a direct impact on the town's success in marketing themselves as a tourism or as a tourist destination. So I won a contract to build a new website for the town. And once it got built, they couldn't get a hold of their domain name. So of course, we worked with GoDaddy for 7 months trying to get control of a domain name that an old developer had. All the while, this website was just waiting to launch. So once the town site was up and we started getting data about that, I started working with the Chambers of Commerce and their nonprofit organizations. We've gotten great data off the various websites, and GoDaddy hosts everything. So my GoDaddy Pro account is really what gave us that success, because we were struggling with, gaining rights to domain names and being able to bring all of these sites together.
Where can people find you online to learn a little bit more about what you do in your business?
We're at spidertrainers.com, but our business is really, we're this community. So it's pinetoplakeside.com and pinetoplakesidechamber.com and sholochamber.com.
For more information about GoDaddy Pro, visit godaddy.com/pro for tools to support your business.
Okay, now let's get back to the show and see if we can help you take your WordPress consulting business to the next level.
Hey guys, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Mike, and today I am joined by Andrew Craig. Andrew, how you doing?
Good, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. Very kind of you.
No, not at all. Thanks for coming on. So, Andrew, you are the author of the book How to Own the World, which is kind of, is it Thinking Globally and Investing Wisely, I think is the little tagline.
Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, so for those who don't know who you are, could you give us a quick introduction as to how you kind of came about with the book and this kind of
cool.
Plain English finance?
Tell me about yourself. That's always quite a difficult question, isn't it? So, I mean, I'm one of those evil city bankers, and I started work for Swiss Bank in the late 90s. And after doing that for, I guess it must have been about 15 years, I became an increasingly angry young man. And basically, I just kept sort of going to dinner parties or, whatever, in the pub, you speak to people. And it became really clear to me that financial literacy is just such a huge miss. It's like a huge societal blind spot. I mean, and weirdly enough, even people who work in sort of pretty high paid central, front office jobs up in the city or in New York or wherever else are surprisingly bad actually at their own kind of financial affairs. And I've said it before, I did a degree in economics, and I came out of doing a degree in economics at a half decent uni, knowing basically nothing about, the nitty gritty of what's an ISA, what's a SIP, really. I knew lots of theory about how inflation affected interest rates and stuff, but not the nuts and bolts of some kind of putting a sensible strategy in place to sort of win with investment. And so what I decided to do, basically, I set up a website in about 2011, and I found myself writing lots of content for the website, and I just wanted to put lots of free kind of stuff up on the website. And actually, it was my cousin who said to me one day, "Do you realize you've got nearly 100,000 words of content on here? Wouldn't that potentially be better as a book?" There was me, naive, pretty new to the world of websites, and
Sure.
the people who watch this podcast will know a lot more about this than I did, certainly. Yeah. And I just thought, well, that's obviously a no-brainer, and hence the first edition was called Own the World, and we got it live in, I think, January of 2013. And then, weirdly enough, lots of people bought it, which was a surprise to me more than anyone else.
Useful content, right?
Yeah, well, hopefully, and I think, I mean, that's sort of perhaps like false modesty in that I do massively believe in the message that I set out in the book. Which is basically, as I said earlier, I think financial literacy truly is a silver bullet, and it is for the individual, because if you sort your finances out, which is far easier, as I hope we'll come on to, it's far easier than most people are led to believe in the course of their kind of, schooling or even university education. If you can sort that out, it means you're not going to be on the welfare rosters. It means you'll be able to look after you and yours. It means, frankly, life gets a lot less stressful. And a lot easier if you can sort of put some of these basic building blocks in place and navigate kind of all the nonsense. The book's really, the whole point of the book was to try and be an idiot's guide in some ways, but sort of a combination of an idiot's guide with a bit of a slightly more sophisticated overlay of the idea of owning the world, basically.
Yeah, and this was basically a friend of mine, Steve. Hello, Steve, if you're watching. He turned me onto the book because when I started my agency as a business, my big panic, and I know that this is a lot of problem with some of the other guys who are in this kind of space, was my pension's going to disappear or my 401k is just going to disappear.
Yeah.
All of this money, I'm like, what am I going to do? I didn't think, well, selling my business, I can't rely on that. So that was how he turned me onto the book. He was like, "Oh, you should read this book called How to Own the World." And I was like, I don't know anything about money. I don't know anything about
like most of the people who work in the city and in New York in financial services firms, by the way.
And that was what I picked up. I was like, oh, it's not just me. It's actually the people who run some of these organizations. So
it's slightly disingenuous and slightly unfair, because there are obviously lots of skillful professionals, but certainly for lots of people who are graduate or even postgraduate level folk doing a whole, working in a whole range of roles, you'll say to them, "Do you have a pension?" And quite often they'll go, and they'll have to think about whether they have a pension or not. And then if you say, "What's in your pension?" In 10 years of asking that question, only one person has ever actually been able to answer that question. What's in it, and how much are you paying the pension provider? So anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's perfect. That kind of leads me on to this next bit. So at the highest level, financial literacy, a lot of us are freelancers and consultants and digital marketers and stuff. It's something that we didn't think we'd ever get into.
Yeah.
But why is this important, even as people who aren't employed, as freelancers and self-employed people, or we run businesses? Yeah. Why is financial literacy so important?
I think because ultimately it just makes life so much easier. And, if you are a freelancer, your income can be very lumpy. You can have a great quarter or a great year, and then you can have a really lean dry patch when the economy goes off or your particular market goes off. And, I always say that if you learn about finance and you can make sort of sensible returns that are eminently achievable, it's not long before you've built a really big nest egg, and then that nest egg can then throw off returns itself. Yep. And so, this obviously, it would be naive to think that a 22-year-old could just know a bit about finance and suddenly it's life changing. But grinding that out gradually, I think sort of preempt maybe a question you're going to ask is sort of, if you're a freelancer, how do you decide how much money you want to keep for potential capex in your business and growing the business and everything else? And there's a great book called The Richest Man in Babylon. I forget who it's by.
Clayson,
George Clason or Clayson or something like that.
Yeah.
And the one thing I took away from that, it's quite an odd book, to be honest, but
Yeah.
nothing ventured, nothing gained. But the one overriding thing I took away from that, which, and he's not the only person who said it, but I think he's probably one of the first, is always put 10% of everything you earn into investments. And I think that applies, I've got my own business. I've got Plain English Finance. I've put a ton of my own money into that business.
Of course.
And I had a couple of years where I wasn't working at all, and I was 100% focused on that, where I didn't put 10% of I didn't have any income. I was investing it all in the business. Yeah. So no doubt lots of your listeners, people watching, have been through that sort of process. But I think the simple rule is, as soon as you have income, in whatever time period you want to call it, whether it's weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, preferably probably monthly is probably the easiest way of doing it. Yeah. Put 10% of whatever you have made that month, whether it's in the business or, we all like to have businesses so we can arrange our tax affairs and, take things and all that good stuff, which is very sensible. Obviously, that's the subject of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, or one of the themes in that book, which is quite right. But, what net, whether it's in an investment account that you have with your business, which is one way to get a little bit if the business is a bit bigger, but whatever you're netting as an individual, every single, let's call it a month just for the sake of simplicity, 10% needs to go into sensible investments. Yeah. And then, of course, the next question is, well, what should they be? But you no doubt had another question. So.
No. This is perfect, because this is kind of leading me on to. It's interesting because when anyone who's from a more traditional background, who would be employed and have a 9-to-5 job, and they say, Mike, you run your own business, the first thing they ask is, how do I pay the mortgage? Yeah. And I'm like,
and how did you get a mortgage to start with? Well, that was before I started my business. Exactly.
Was that before I started my business? Actually. Yeah. And I'm like, well, I pay the mortgage with money, just like everybody else. I don't really understand the difference. And the second thing is, they go, do you have a pension? Yeah. My answer is no, because I know they're expecting me, oh, do you have a mutual life or a friend's life account? And I don't. But I am putting money away that basically, like you say, builds a nest egg, and personally I believe gives better returns. The problem is, as soon as I start talking about that to freelancers and consultants, they go, oh, it's very risky, very scary, very complicated. There's like the Gleasons of the world who have
absolutely
put this forward.
But underperforming is also risky.
Yeah.
And particularly so not doing this risks having quite an impoverished kind of retirement, right? And so if I can just a couple of things are quite powerfully illustrative. So firstly, what the results can be, right? And an example I quite often use when I'm at a speaking event is, if Great Aunt Agatha put £5,000 into a tax-free account, like an ISA, for example, the day your kid is born, the day a child is born, no further investment whatsoever, just the $5,000 one-off thing, and you were able to achieve high single digits. We're going to say 10% just to keep the maths easy, right? Yep. We can come on to how on earth do you make 10% consistently? Interest rates are, nothing, and we'll come on to that in a sec. But just to work with the example, how much money would that child have on their 55th birthday, the first day they can legally retire? Do you know the answer to that?
So if that's 10% compound from $5,000
exactly,
over 5 years,
$5,500 becoming so on and so forth. Of 55. £945,000, right? So, okay, there are certain parameters we're talking about there, which people could sort of ask questions about. So I've got my phone's going in the corner. Apologies, I've just got rid of it. But so let's interrogate that. Fine, 55 years. One of the biggest allies you have in investment is time. Which is why it's really important for people in their 20s. If you get this sort in your 20s, it just pays enormous dividends later in your life. But how might you, aspire to make 10% a year? Because that sounds ridiculous, right? Yeah. But that's where the whole owning the world notion comes from, which is that. So the Rothschild family for 200 years have been able. Owning the world just means if you can own all assets in all major geographical regions, which to all intents and purposes just means the States, Europe, and I include Britain and Europe for the time being, and Japan and the rest of Asia. If you can do that, and if you can own all assets, so not just shares or the risky stock market, but shares, bonds, commodities, and including that precious metals, and maybe even a bit of cryptocurrency these days, but that's perhaps a bit of a red herring. But if you basically own all assets in all geographies, you can realistically aspire to banging out certainly high single digits and in many years low double-digit returns across the economic cycle, no matter what's happening. And you can illustrate that point. There are a couple of ways of doing it. But firstly, think about this: global GDP output in the year 2000 was $32 trillion. Right. Near as we can measure it. By 2015, it was $85 trillion. So that's a 163.5% growth in global GDP, in the size of the world economy, in about 15 years. Now, the maths don't, there are complexities in here, but it's just illustrates the fact that if you divide 160% by 15 years, that's your kind of roughly 10-ish percent. That's, if you can access that through stock market investments, which by the way you can, and if you can hedge it, because the other thing I was going to evidence this with is, so people say it's risky. Yeah, of course. The S&P 500, the US stock market, the FTSE 100, whichever stock market you care to look at, all of them fell by more than 50% from 07 to 09. Terrible, right? Terrible for most conventional British pension funds and most types of investment, because they're very stock market focused. But what did oil do in 2008? It hit an all-time high of $147 a barrel, now trading at 50, right? What did gold do in 2009? It went up 19.5%, right? And so the insight here, and this is not my idea. I'm not the first. The Rothschild family have become the richest people in the world by investing.
Doing this.
For 200 years. Now they could do it. In 1812, Waterloo, they made a killing in the London bond market because they had homing pigeons get back from the battle quicker, and they knew that Britain had won.
That I did not know.
It's a good little story, isn't it? But the Rothschild family had an infrastructure of investment bankers, partly their family in Amsterdam, Frankfurt, London, and everywhere else in 18 whatever, right? Harvard and Yale University have been doing since the 1950s, right? And the smartest people in the world, the wealthiest and smartest people have invested like this. The problem for the man in the street was you couldn't do this until financial innovation came along in the last, I would say the last decade, but frankly, even today, it's not. There are lots of different ways of skinning the cat in terms, but there's, I've got to be a bit careful because I was about to preempt the fact that we're planning to launch our own fund, which is an own the world fund, which is a strategy that basically does everything that I talk about in the book, but you're not allowed to market a fund before it exists. So hence why I was just pulling myself back from the brink. But my point is, that's going to be a one-stop shop product to own the world with one fund. At the moment, to achieve the same sort of result, you'd have to own an equity fund or a global multi-asset fund. There's not quite the pure solution yet that you'd like to see. But
so this is so much, and I kind of want to disseminate, because some of our guys listening, this will be like rocket science to them. First of all, the big question that I get is, stocks and shares is tricky, blah, blah, blah. If I'm doing it myself, Mike, and the truth is I don't really do it myself. My app, the app that I use does it, and it's 2 or 3 things that I put money into. But the first question I ask is, what do you think a pension fund is doing? They are doing the same thing.
But well, that's right. And I think one of the big sort of misunderstandings that people have in the UK market, particularly, and I suppose with 401ks and stuff in the States as well, is that they think of, people will say to me, forgive my bad language, but people will say to me, pensions are shit. Right? And that's like saying cars are shit. Because a pension is just a kind of tax sheltered account in which you can do one of thousands of things, and an ISA is the same. That's just another kind of shell account. And actually, another point I make quite often is, being British is an incredibly fortunate thing if you want to accrue wealth, because obviously it's better than being Syrian or unfortunate someone like Afghanistan or Syria or Somalia or somewhere where clearly we have a massive advantage over those sorts of developing countries, but we have a huge advantage over a lot of other countries, developed countries, in terms of these tax sheltered accounts that are a legacy of, Britain being an innovator in financial services going back to the Victorian era. And it's just, to me, when people say to me pensions are shit, I just think it's such a crying shame, because all it is a method and an account within which you can sort of do what you want to do very tax efficiently.
And this is an important point as well. This strategy is essentially, it is globally applicable, right? We have guys in America, Australia, Asia, Africa, England, Europe. This is not a Western thing. It's not even a British thing.
Well, that's right. Although, if you say the basic idea is that you want to own all major stock markets, and all the other major markets. So you want to have some gold, you want to have some bonds, you want to have. It is. It's interesting you say that, because yes, it is globally applicable, but the ease with which your particular nation states financial services will facilitate it for you is hugely different. And so in the States it's very easy, in Britain it's very easy, on the continent it can actually be quite hard and quite expensive, in my experience. And I've also had, I mean, a lot of expats have obviously come across my book, and I've, you know, had numerous phone calls with people in places like Singapore, Sydney, Kuala Lumpur, and actually a lot of them have come on to me and then found that they're incredibly frustrated because they can't work out how to kind of replicate the, you know, what I advocate for people in the British market in just in places like Singapore or Kuala Lumpur. And I mean, no doubt that will change. And actually, you know, sadly, I'm not an expert on every single retail financial services market in the world. And if I, you know, dare I confess, but if I, you know, if I went to Singapore, no doubt I could figure it out over the course of a few weeks and a few meetings. But at present, the way that people can implement this if they're based in Singapore is as I've found out so far, very expensive, very much more expensive than it is in the UK. But the underlying strategy is entirely applicable wherever you are in the world. So I mean, I guess the answer is, if you are a Brit based in Singapore, you should probably just carry on using British financial services providers.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say that I go, okay, I understand I need to build a nest egg. I need to start putting money away and putting it away. The first thing I think a lot of people want to do is put it in a savings account. Yeah. And the big thing you taught me is that if that savings account has an interest rate lower than inflation, you're losing money. Yeah. So what do I start? What do I need to start doing from a real base level?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think so. If we can just dwell on, you know, the British audience, because it's probably easiest to begin with. I mean, America has similar kind of accounts to these, so it kind of applies. You know, we already talked about save 10% of everything you earn, and you know, if you were intending to grow your business and you need to put everything possible by, because you need to buy a piece of capital equipment, or you know, you need a new member of staff or whatever else, and you're at that very developmental stage of business, and obviously that might be an exception, but broadly, if at all possible throughout your life, with your personal finances, put by 10%, you know, hammer that point home. So then the next thing to do is to find wherever you reside, the most optimal kind of tax sheltered account. Now, I'm a massive believer in the UK market in the ISA over pretty much everything else, because the pension, and we can get into the nitty gritty of this, but frankly, the problem with the pension is, for anybody under about the age of 50, I think it's incredibly unlikely that the pension will exist. And in 2008, the Argentinian government nationalized pensions. Middle-class Argentinians who were doctors and lawyers and whatever, who'd saved diligently into their private pensions, the government confiscated all their money overnight. That's, you know, Argentina's a reasonably modern, you know, Buenos Aires is not Mogadishu, not one of in Mogadishu, but you know, and overnight, people who worked for their lives had all their money taken by the government. Now, I think there's a chance that could happen in Western democracies, given the parlous state of.
I agree. Yeah.
So whereas an ISA, and why might that not happen to an ISA? Because the aggregate ISA pot is so much smaller, right? So and you can sell your ISA tomorrow and take your money out. Whereas your pension, you can't access legally until you're 55, right? So I think for younger listeners or viewers, it's definitely an ISA account in the UK market, and America has similar accounts. So, and then you set up a direct debit with a really good quality stockbroking firm. I mean, and I have no commercial relationship with them, but I happen to love a firm called Hargreaves Lansdown.
Yeah, I use those too as well.
So I mean, look, I've used 8 stockbroking firms in my life, and I've ended up with most of my stuff with them, purely because it's the only company in Britain, when I call, somebody articulate and intelligent who can help me answers the phone within 4 rings. Yeah, I don't get that from British Airways, from O2, from British Gas, from, you know, you insert any company in Britain.
I can't call up my ISP.
And
yet Hargreaves Lansdown does nothing but try and like the app as well is amazing. You know?
No, quite. And so I'm a big fan of those. People have sort of pushed back about that and say they're a bit expensive, but you know, my answer is, well, a Range Rover is more expensive than a Ford Mondeo. You get what you pay for, whatever else. But and I happen to think they're just a quality outfit. There are alternatives. There's another outfit called AJ Bell that people are very complimentary about. You know, it doesn't to be honest, it doesn't really matter. All that matters is that whoever you use gives you access to a big range of investments, and you're able to set up a direct debit into an ISA account, and you know, each month 10% of what you've earned goes in that. You know, obviously somebody with a conventional job, that direct debit 10% is the same number each month. And if you're, as we talked about earlier, if you have lumpier income, then you'll have to kind of do it manually. You know, this month my 10% is more than last month or whatever. But once you've done that, then, you know, the first thing to do for people who are conservative and worried, just pay it in there as cash. So you get into the habit. If people are watching this thinking, this is crazy, this guy, you know, stock market investment is not for me, just let cash build up. With interest rates where they are right now, the fact that you're missing out on 0.9% of interest, because you know they're going to pay tiny peppercorn interest on that. But just get into the habit. And I would always say, depending on how risk averse or risk inclined you are, you know, you should build a rainy day pot. Yeah. So your first 1, 3, 6 months of cash that goes in just stays as cash.
Yeah.
But after that, all you have to do is find interesting, actually, if you look at the long run statistics, you could pretty much invest in anything. I know that sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example of why that is.
Yeah.
If your goal here is to, let's say you're 35 for the sake of argument, and you're going to invest from 35 to 60, right? For the next 25 years, every month you're going to pay in, as we're discussing. Now, what you ideally want is something that's going to return 8, 9, 10, 11, 12% through the cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are actually, if you stick to your guns and you invest monthly, which means you're smooth. So if you invested in a stock market investment in March 2007, and it then crashed immediately afterwards, if you're investing every month, you're buying it at the cheaper price, right? So a lot of people understand this. It's called averaging in. And that's why I said it. That's why I sort of slightly tongue in cheek said it almost doesn't matter. Because I'll give you an example. So two pretty high profile business professors at the London Business School, Elroy Dimpson and Paul Marsh, did a piece a few years ago, a research piece, actually published at the end of 2015, where they found that if you invested in the smallest 2% of companies in the British stock market, going back to 1955, so smaller companies, the bottom 2%, your annual returns would have been just under 16% per annum.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
So all you have to do, so am I saying that all you have to do is invest in UK smaller companies from now on every month for the next 20 years, and you'll be a multi-millionaire? Because if you run it, if anybody out there, you know, people watching probably know how to build Excel spreadsheets. You know, start with £10,000, put out 16% per annum for 20 years and see what you get. It's a lot of money, right? But of course the problem is, and here's the crux, is that in the course of that performance, there were 3 or 4 times, actually maybe 4 or 5 times, 1987, 2000, 2001, 07, 08, 09, where you would have seen your account fall by 50%, the notional value. And very few people are hardwired psychologically to ride that out and go, that's fine. I know, because Andy Craig said, and these 2 professors have shown me empirically, that from 1955 to 2015, small companies did 16% a year. I'm fine. I'll ride it out. What people tend to do is get extremely freaked out and sell out, which is why the simpler thing to do, by all means, people watching should get a UK smaller companies fund if they feel brave and they're willing to, on a 25-year time horizon, you are very, very likely to make double-digit returns. Okay, as long as you stick with it, and when the crashes come, you carry on putting money in every month. Okay, but for most people's sanity and sleeping well at night, it is easier to do what I call owning the world, which is that you own a balanced, as I said earlier, for the points I made earlier, if you own American shares, Japanese shares, British shares, European shares, some gold, some silver, some agricultural commodities, you're not going to have that volatility. Right? You're basically going to grind. It is the tortoise, not the hare. And because of the way we're hardwired psychologically, the tortoise generally beats the hare, actually. Because if you'd held on and bought UK smaller companies, which are risky, or let's say a biotech fund or whatever, you would, if you'd held on, you would have made those returns. But most people don't hold on. Most people, it's like the poker player who freaks out,
and this is certainly what a lot of my guys talk to me about, because I've got a course within WP Elevation on planning for profit. It's actually what to do with your dinner plate of money and kind of putting it out and stuff. And they've kind of spoken to me like, but stocks and shares, I hear all these horror stories of people losing. And I'm like, you have to understand that investing for a nest egg, a long-term pension fund, saving over 25 years or 20 years is not day trading. They're completely different things. You're not doing the whole like watching tickers and stuff. That's they're not even in the same industry. Like it's completely different things,
And your returns are actually negatively correlated to the amount of time that you spend watching the news and going, what should I do about Brexit? This is what drives me mad. Like people go, well, what about Brexit? I shouldn't invest right now because of Brexit, or Donald Trump's just got into the White House. So it's a terrible time to invest. Nonsense. You got to do the old see no evil, hear no evil, close your eyes, stick your fingers in the ear and go la 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 la, and ignore the news always. Because if you put a sensible investment strategy in place, that does, what I'm talking about. And you continue to pay into it month in, month out over a lifetime of investment. If you structure it well from tax perspective, i.e. by put in an ISA, or if you're a bit older, maybe use a pension, but go back to what we said earlier about pensions versus ISAs. If you do that, by the time you're 55, 57, 50, whenever it is you want to take, have a pretty big lump sum, you will have one.
Yeah.
And by hedging, as I say, I call it, owning the world is about hedging out risk both by geography and by asset class.
Yeah.
And if you do that, investing isn't that risky actually. But I mean, the other comment I made is, nobody drives a car before they've passed their driving test, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And financial products seem to be the only products that people buy without actually understanding anything about them, which is mental. Because if you go to buy a car, you go and buy like Exchange and Mart and What Car, and you pour over them at the weekend.
Yeah, of course.
And then you do a decent job of knowing how much to pay for a specific car with leather seats. But people go, oh, I'm going to get a pension. Like the most important purchase of their life, investing money, they do it without any preparation or thought or work at all. And so funnily enough, it's the same, or like if you bought a car, if you drove on a motorway without passing a driving test, there's a pretty high chance you'd crash.
Yeah.
So, what I tried to do in How to Own the World was just to get people from sort of complete fear and ignorance of investment to basically feeling reasonably confident that they can invest.
Yeah.
In sadly 100 pages. I wish I could do it in 3 pages, but you can't.
Yeah, and that was another thing is like there's actually an enormous amount of information out there that's good information that's been around a long time. Weirdly, like David Lynch's book on like beating the market, Warren Buffett's got a couple of them, and I was expecting these things to be like thick, dense tomes, and actually they're relatively easy to read, and they really these are the top investors in the world. And they all basically say the same thing.
Yeah. And Warren Buffett is famous for making the point that being a really successful investor doesn't require an IQ of 160.
Yeah.
Like, I can't remember his quote, but it's something like, somebody with a perfectly normal IQ. Obviously, most of the people watching this have very high IQ.
Shockingly high.
The self-selecting. Yeah,
and
exactly.
Really good looking as well.
Yeah, exactly right. But it's not a game for rocket. You don't need to be a rocket scientist or a genius. And that was what I tried to set out in the book, was just, what's the fastest route from A to B? What is a share? What's the stock market? What are interest rates? What's inflation? What's gold? And crucially, how do you invest in them in a sensible way? Yeah. And that sounds ridiculously, but nobody gets taught that.
No, and we don't get taught it at school. This is the biggest thing I'm now finding, kind of, starting a family and stuff, is they'll be like, oh, what is a mortgage? What is tax? What is savings? And like, worry not. Mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I'm like, when am I going to use that?
Exactly. You do some simultaneous equations for me, please. Yeah.
You'll need this one day. When?
Yeah. The von Schlieffen plan in the First World War. Yeah. How did that? I know, but it is. But happily, that's the bad news. The good news is that and these sorts of podcasts are all part of this. That, as you say, access to information and sort of knowledge is easier than ever before. But I suppose the problem with that is that how do you see the wood for the trees? Because you could go off down a lot of blind alleys. And I think my answer to that is, if you're looking to educate yourself about finances, seek out stuff about the fundamentals, not about what the latest stock is or what the latest fad is, or what are interest rates, what is the bond market. That's the sort of end. There's a great book by a guy called Niall Ferguson, who's a Scottish but based in Harvard economic historian. He wrote a book called The Ascent of Money. Okay. Actually, on my website, there's a blog article called The 8 Best Finance Books of All Time, and I think it's one of them. Oh, cool. I'm not expecting everyone to read 8 books, but all I'm doing is that The Ascent of Money is just an example of somebody talking about the nuts and bolts of what is money and how do financial markets develop. And it's actually quite, like anything, the more you know about it, the more interesting it becomes.
Yeah. And this is the thing. I think there's a huge amount of fear, again, particularly in the freelance, own business, entrepreneurial world. That we have a fear of money, and I think it's not because money is terrifying; it's because we're not educated on it.
Well, and also, frankly, in the freelance/entrepreneurial world, I genuinely know this myself. Having started playing in finance, there's an awful lot of work to do.
Yeah, of course.
And there are so many clients to call and admin to do and regulatory paperwork to fill in and getting accounts. And, it sometimes it is a lot more hardcore than having a normal day job. And so money is just, in the sort of box of responsibilities you have running your own business, you probably park that. But, I guess the message to take away from this is don't, because over 20 years plus, hopefully your judicious saving and sensibly investing will mean you've probably made as much as you've made out of your business.
Yeah.
That's my aim, is generally to see the wealth I produce from investment being around about the same as what I produce from work.
Yep, absolutely.
Hopefully that will end up. I'll smash it out of the water.
Yeah, we want to hope to smash it out of the water, mate. That's what we want to do.
No, I meant when I float my business, that will be pure nonsense. But I'll still be saving my 10% a month.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. So, all right, so let's go over this, because I think there's one more point that I wanted to cover.
Sure.
Long and short is we want to start saving 10% of whatever comes in, right? And like you say, for some people, when that's monthly, that's great. Now, we actually try to teach our guys how to create monthly recurring revenue.
Yeah.
So there is a way to be able to take 10% of that. But even if I have 10% coming kind of sporadically, quarterly, take 10% of that, put it somewhere, right?
Yeah, exactly right.
And we can find sheltered accounts.
Yep. Wherever you sit in the world, just try and find the sort of optimal tax sheltered accounts.
Yeah. And there's information out there on how to...
Exactly. Although, I mean, if you're in the UK, I'm always really scathing of the high street banks, right?
Yeah.
It's worth saying that there's no one in your local branch of Lloyds, NatWest, Barclays, Santander who is of any value whatsoever in this process.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I hope I don't get sued for saying that. I mentioned all of them, but I remember walking into one of them on Moorgate in the city of London. It's like the epicenter of finance in the world.
Yep.
And speaking to an account, a financial advisor, and they didn't even realize that there were ISA products other than the ones that bank sold.
Yeah, it's kind of staggering, right?
It is, and it's a huge business opportunity.
Yeah,
obviously.
I used to work just down the street from Moorgate, actually, in Water Street, and that was where the big tech company was that we worked at.
Right.
Interestingly enough, their finance department was on the same team, and they would advise us on things like pensions. And that was when I started to think, why is it that I'm arguing?
Yeah.
Like I shouldn't be. I should be just believing them if what it was say is true. So,
but the whole model of financial advice in Britain, sadly, which kind of stems from it probably. I mean. This isn't particularly well backed by evidence. This is me kind of gut feel shooting from here, but I'm sort of thinking about it, is that ultimately, British financial services developed in London 1700 onwards, whatever, and developed to cater for aristocrats who were landowners, right?
Yep.
So they'd come in and they had money coming out of their ears, and they'd kind of just, lots of sharp, smart people in the city with, and that, unfortunately, that shadow is still cast.
Yep.
When somebody pays 3% per annum to a financial services provider when they don't need to, that's because of that legacy. But yeah, definitely seek out. I mean, look, I'd say it, wouldn't I? But hopefully, most of this ground is covered in my book.
Yeah, of course,
and that's the point of it. But don't want to get too salesy.
No, this is good. We're doing all this kind of stuff, so that's fine. That's good. And it's interesting you say about it's a lot of hang-ups. We try to talk about this, like the concept of doing 9 to 5 days a week is a hang-up from the Victorian era when they had factories and they had to get wool out during the daytime.
Yeah, exactly. And the kilns had to be switched on for however length of time. Otherwise, they couldn't be powered down at the weekend. Yeah, exactly.
So, like, we don't need to live in that world anymore, but that's the world we're taught. And that's kind of the next point that you mentioned, is that it is actually easier than ever to start your journey in this way, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean that the sort of I quite often when I do speaking events, depending on how much time I got, I talk about the bad news being, if you want to make the average British salary per annum as the amount of money you return on your investments, you need about 700 grand to make about 30 grand a year, right?
Yeah.
The average person in this country has 30 grand at retirement.
Yeah.
Don't be one of those people, because the other point to make is the government, as we talked about earlier, I think it's highly unlikely 15, 20 years from now, the government will be able to pay people a livable pension because of all the demographic bulge and all that good stuff. But the good news is, sort of pivoting back to what you were saying a minute ago, is that if you can do this, and if you can make 10% per annum, if you start early, then you can get to that kind of £700,000. Truly.
Yeah. And that's what I like about compound interest. I mean,
yeah, well, exactly.
For Einstein to say compound interest is the most powerful force, the man who kind of
the eighth wonder of the world.
Yeah, it is.
Although I have read somewhere online that was attributed to him in error, but who knows? It's like all those marvelous Winston Churchill quotes that he probably never actually said because he probably wasn't that rude.
Yeah, 'cause you read them on a beer coaster.
Yeah,
Man, you're like, oh, that's really smart. Yeah, all is fine. But never let the truth get in the way of a good story, right?
exactly.
Yeah, and we want to find something to invest in so we can put it away in this account and then find a broker, and the broker can help us with what to invest in. But also, it's not like we say, we're not choosing day stocks every single day. We're going to do a couple of things.
I mean, yeah,
funds is the broadest term, funds.
Exactly. So a fund is just, a fund was created. The first British fund was Foreign Colonial Investment Trust in 1868.
Wow.
And the idea was just that there were always minimum amounts you could invest in a share, right?
Yeah.
So think about my point about diversification. So now, with a fund like the one we're hoping to launch, you can put 100 quid a month in, and you can own all Japanese shares, all American shares, all European shares, and gold and oil and all this good stuff. So back then, obviously before the technology was available to facilitate that, in 1870 or whatever, if you wanted to get diversification, you had to be extraordinarily rich, because you had to buy, like, let's say £100, and think about what a pound was worth in Victorian era. You had to buy £100 of each of the companies listed on the London stock market. So some extremely smart person came up with the idea of a pooled investment, which is what a fund is, which is basically that, if you've only got 10 quid a month back then, or nowadays 100 quid a month to invest, but you want to own all the FTSE 100, all 100 shares, you end up owning, like, a quid's worth of each of them notionally, right? But so that's why funds exist, and funds have obviously developed way beyond that, and now you can own funds that own thousands of assets in them.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us on to our last point. This is a long-term strategy, just in the same mindset as your pension. You're not going to be cashing this out. You need to ride out what's coming and start to Tim Ferriss in 4-Hour Workweek calls it information ignorance.
Yeah,
like, actually all this information coming towards you actually doesn't help you.
Well, I call it news hygiene. That whole sort of.
I'm gonna use
it. But the amount of time we waste listening to the news telling us X, Y, and Z, it has no bearing on your finances. If you have taken a worldview and got yourself organized and set up a direct debit, it's a set and forget thing. Now, that having been said, obviously this is an audience of entrepreneurs and freelancers, as we've talked about. And the great thing about an ISA, focusing on the UK market, and I know there are similar products in the States, maybe the Roth IRA, I can't quite remember the nomenclature, but the UK market is that, with a pension, your money's locked up.
Yeah.
Till you're 55. At least with an ISA, in extremis, if an acquisition comes along that you just desperately want to buy, and you've managed to get 67 grand saved over the previous few years into your ISA accounts, you can dip it. I mean, you have to make that decision when you come to it, but that, at least you have the flexibility. It's not like
I've done it. A tech share came up, and I was like, I really want to get on board with this, and because I'd also been keeping 10% of my 10% aside as cash.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, I can buy this. I was like,
yeah.
I can just take this, and it's done really well.
Although I hope you had the checklist of several dozen things that you should definitely. People keep coming up to me. People often, just the nature of what I do. People say, "Oh, my mate said that I should buy, insert tiny little share in the Toronto stock market or in Japan or whatever. What do you reckon?" And my first question is, okay, well, that share was 4 whatever last week. It's been 1 before and 9 before. It's the same company at 1, 4, and 9. How do you know? Do you know how to work out when to buy a share? And my point is just, you should never invest in single shares, or indeed a single commodity, like people who want to invest in lithium or, these sort of fads and these themes. You can invest in them, and there's great power now in Hargreaves Lansdown or spread betting, or whatever. You're able to invest in, but you must be very clear that you really understand, how does share valuation work? What's return on capital employed? What's a PE ratio? What's an EV/EBITDA ratio? And what's the difference? And if you can't answer those questions, you bloody shouldn't be investing in single shares, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I guess a part of this as well is, like, I think we're scared of money because we're scared to lose it. We try at the WP Elevation to try and teach an abundancy mindset.
Yeah.
And part of that comes from understanding that money is just like any asset. It's like any tool, and you can probably always find more of it. And hopefully by using it more, you learn how to use it better in the future.
And like anything else, like any other habit, when it becomes a habit. So that's why it's probably done to death. But the idea of a savings habit, if you have a savings habit, it's like having a smoking habit. It's really hard to quit.
Stop it. Yeah. There's even an app now that will take your purchases on your phone?
Yeah, there's a brilliant app. Well, I forget the name of it. I just spotted the other day, where if you click in your Oyster card or your Apple Pay or whatever, it rounds up to the nearest pound and saves that for you.
I think Moneybox.
Moneybox, yeah, which I love. I love that, particularly for millennials, because it is tough. Rents are really high. You know, the cost of living is tricky, and it takes a few years to get to a point where you're getting paid appropriately. But at least along the way, Moneybox is probably quite a good way, because that's the other thing, that having a savings habit, it's remarkable how quickly your pot builds. I mean, I did a paper round when I was a young lad before I went off to school, to actually went away to another school, but I got paid 15 quid a week. Which is quite a lot, but in Southwest London. And by the time I went to uni, I had a few grand. You know, now interest, and I was making about 10% per annum in the post office interest rate, which sadly you can't make in interest rates anymore, but you can make from owning the world.
You absolutely can. And that kind of brings to a close that call. That's a perfect segue to the end there with the how to own the world. Andy, this is just, honestly, I could talk to you for hours about this, because it's beyond fascinating to me.
You're very kind. I'm sure your listeners don't want us to do that.
Well, you'd be surprised. A lot of them do kind of reach out, and they're like, where do you find this stuff, Mike? And I'm like, I don't know. There's a lot of stuff rattling around.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'd be very happy to come on again, because we scratched the surface, and we could do topic by topic. So another few months or whenever suits you, I'm really happy to talk about maybe more of the specifics of what to invest in.
That'd be really good. That'd be awesome. Okay, so in the meantime, how can people reach out to you?
So the website is plainenglishfinance.com. Or .co.uk. So plain English finance, exactly as expected, is spelt. But also if you go to amazon.co.uk and type in "How to Own the World" by Andrew Craig, you'll find it. And then the book, obviously, you're then in my clutch of souls, hopefully. I mean, we have a free email list, which I absolutely don't bombard people. I write something. I struggle to write something too often, so I probably average once every 3 or 4 weeks. But when I do write something, I'd like to think it's usually pretty useful for people. And you can see that on the opinion bit of our website to see what I've written in the last few years.
Cool. Yeah, no, I definitely recommend that as well. Again, especially if you want to start getting less scared of this stuff, there is resources out there. And Plain English Finance, the blog there, I've always found very easy to disseminate. And also, when that little fear thing comes into your mind and you hear something, you can't help it. Someone says something, and I'm like, do you know what? I'm going to go read something. And 9 times out of 10, it sort of puts that fear to rest.
Yeah, absolutely. Action is the antidote to despair, or whatever.
Yeah, there you go. So guys, if you're listening to this, remember to go to wpelevation.com/Andrew Craig, download our tools worksheet. So this is the tools that WP Elevation uses. And you can also subscribe to the podcast there and leave us some comments on what you'd like to see next. Andrew, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Speak to you soon. Thanks, Mike.
Wow, I hope you enjoyed that episode of the podcast as much as I did. I absolutely loved talking to Andrew. Really, really cool guy. Remember to visit wpelevation.com/Andrew Craig to watch this episode, get access to the tools list, and leave us some feedback in the comment section below. Please subscribe to the podcast and giving us a rating and review in iTunes. It really helps us spread the word. And of course, don't forget to tell people as well, tell your friends and tell other colleagues that you know about the WP Elevation podcast. Just visit wpelevation.com/iTunes. Thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to your company on the next episode of the podcast. Until then, go elevate.